Hello, everyone. My name is Aishwarya Joshi. I am a senior research manager in the technical consulting team at Well Labs.
Hello everyone, my name is Sudeep Banad. I work as associate hydrologist in technical consulting team at Vella.
Today, both of us are here in this video to talk about the Water Index for Sustainability, Equity, and Resilience. Um, in short, WISER. This is a very exciting initiative that we've been working on at Well Labs for the better part of last year. And today we want to take you through all of the work that we have done on WISER in phase one, a little bit about the initiative itself. With this Water Index for Sustainability, Equity, and Resilience, we want to bridge the gap that currently exists in the water sector around water security monitoring. And our aim is to really and uh, create a structured framework as well as create consensus around such a framework that can help track meaningful outcome based indicators that can help us in mainly three outcomes. One is data driven decision making. So, with a framework like WISER, we hope to help stakeholders take better decisions, make better allocations, whether it's for funds or for resources. And eventually, that leads to more effective interventions around water resources management in India. So let's start with why we require such a water index. Water is a big problem in India. We know that India is one of the most severely water stressed countries in the world. But this is not a very simple problem to solve. You may, of course, have read a lot of different kinds of news where we have severe, chronic, or seasonal water shortages in the country. There are some parts which constantly are struggling with too little water, but there are also parts of the country where there are extreme weather events with more and more frequency now, and that leads to floods and a lot of water where we are not able to manage those kinds of events very well either. And of course, in general, we have a lot of water quality issues around the country, and this has a direct impact on public health systems as well as ecosystems. So, when we have such a multidimensional challenge where it is manifesting in different ways in different parts of the country, we also need to think of how we are conceptualizing this problem of water security in not just a unidimensional or just in the sense of water accessibility or water availability alone, but we really need to think of other aspects which come with water security, which is sustainability, equity, resilience, productivity. These are all different dimensions that come with the phenomenon of water security when we talk about it in this way. Now, these dimensions are all critical to this concept of water security, but they don't always align. So, for example, you may see that it may help groundwater levels, improving groundwater levels if we have groundwater extraction bans in certain parts of the country, but that's actually going to negatively affect marginal farmers and stakeholders who are already at the fringes of society and have a lack of access to water to begin with, right? So there are different dimensions that we need to think about when we talk about water security. And the other part here is that there are definitely a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's the government or philanthropic initiatives, that are spending a lot of money on solutions for improved water security in India. So you may know that the Atal Bhujan Yojana itself has a budget outlay of 6,000 crores. We have more and more CSR and private philanthropy spending coming into the natural resources management and water security sector in India with each passing year. But what we don't really know is if these solutions and these interventions are actually moving the needle on water security in India, because there is limited evidence to really understand if we are making the improvements that we want to make and making the progress that we want to make with respect to water security. So we are not able to measure these outcomes very well, and hence we don't really know a few things, right? We don't know, for example, if worsening forces are prevailing over improving forces in the water sector. We don't know which indicators we should be paying the most attention to guide our interventions. And we also don't know what is a good and effective way of measuring progress on these efforts that we are making towards making India more water secure. And of course, these are not easy questions to answer. For example, if you take a remote tribal area somewhere in Chhattisgarh where water availability and resilience are not really an issue, but access and productivity are, uh, a local grassroots organization or even the government may think that interventions to improve access and productivity are the right choice to make over there. However, since water is a zero sum game, you may find that over time, such interventions, while they may improve access and productivity, they may start having negative effects on water availability, water balance, as well as resilience for the landscape. So as we can see that water is a dynamic and multifaceted issue, and different stakeholders have different perspectives on what's the most important dimension for water security, or even what constitutes water security for them. For example, farmers may be most concerned with irrigation access and productivity. However, policymakers and government stakeholders may be more interested in making sure that groundwater levels are improving in a particular landscape. So you can see that there are a lot of uh, struggling push and pull forces here. And what we really require in the sector today is a consensus on what outcomes matter the most when we talk about water security. Currently, we see that primarily all of the assessments that are happening around water security focus either on inputs, which would be, for example, funds allocated, right? Resources that are going towards a particular dimension of water security that is being solutioned for. Or you would most likely track outputs. So, for example, things like how many check dams have we constructed, how many recharge structures have we constructed. And these are great things to track for day to day progress and just to understand where our efforts are going. But these are not really telling us what the long term outcomes and impact of such activities are. So that's really what we are advocating for, because we believe that the water sector as a whole requires a shift from these input and output based indicators for tracking water security to really shifting from that to an outcome oriented framework, which is really thinking about water security in a more holistic manner at a landscape level and not just at a village or a project level. So you may have heard that what gets measured well gets managed well, and that's really what a good, robust framework, which is going beyond these input output metrics, can really do for water security. Now, if we want to think about why this shift is important, we can think about an analogy which we find very helpful when we have these conversations around the water index. Imagine that the water security of a region is that like that of health of a person, right? When you talk about somebody's overall health, you're really tracking a set of vitals, and ideally you are doing things like annual physical exams to try and see over time how somebody is faring in terms of their health. Now, so say for example, in one of these annual physical exams, a patient complains of uneasiness, chest pain, things like that. The specialist or the doctor may do a particular test, say an ECG, find that the results are abnormal, prescribe a drug which helps lower their cholesterol, and then check for cholesterol and ECG again. Right. Now, what this does is it's really trying to see if a particular intervention is helping a particular problem. And while this is great, and sometimes this is necessary to make sure that the person's overall health is improving, it is not a holistic picture of that person's health. So, asking, did this drug that I prescribed to this patient lower the patient's cholesterol, is not the same as asking how healthy this patient is. So overall health is actually dependent on multiple variables. So you may see that a person is faring well on certain parameters of this kind, but they're not doing so well on others. And then if you really want to improve the overall health of a person, you will want to focus on all of these different dimensions and not just one. Now, if we bring this analogy into the water sector, a funder might ask that in a particular community where farmers were complaining of well failures, uh, we provided an intervention which was to construct check dams, right? Now, have the check dams been effective in raising groundwater levels? uh, we do an impact assessment before and after, and we find out whether or not the intervention was effective. But this is not the same as asking a larger question, which is what is the problem in the watershed, or how healthy is this watershed, right? And not asking this question, which is how healthy is this watershed, is like treating a patient without a health checkup. And since no self respecting doctor would do that, we also want to find some kind of a framework or an equivalent of an annual physical checkup, or this kind of an overall test or an overall framework that can help us track what is happening to a watershed, what is happening to a landscape over time in a more holistic manner. So, what can this equivalent be? This is what we are proposing WISER can serve as. So, an outcomes focused, mutually exclusive, and collectively exhaustive framework that helps us comprehensively and affordably look at all of these various aspects of water security in a way that we can actually use that to make decisions uh, in terms of how to allocate resources, and also do some problem diagnosis when we first start to work in a landscape. And then over time, we can keep applying this framework to actually assess the impact of the intervention that we have decided to implement in that landscape. So with WISER, we have three overarching objectives here. The first is to develop a coherent indicator framework, like I said, something that is scientific, simple to use, but also accurate, relevant to our stakeholders, and something that is scalable over time. So, how do we ensure these things? We want to make sure that we are leveraging existing data, remote sensing methods, and also combining that with systematic primary data collection to make sure that we can move over time from anecdotal evidence around water security to really something more systematic, long term, which helps us with real time tracking of water security trends. Uh, and one of the most important things that we want to make sure we do with WISER, so that we are able to actually use this data to eventually foster change and drive impact, is to be able to visualize and communicate all of this data that we are gathering in a way that is easy to understand and is effective in helping stakeholders make those decisions that they have to make. So we are going to talk you through all of the work that we spent the better part of last year doing for WISER Phase 1. We really wanted to, of course, create this framework, but also spend enough time testing it out, getting feedback from the water sector to really ensure that we are creating something that is speaking to the needs of the water sector and is able to build consensus amongst all these different stakeholders and different perspectives. So the work that we did can broadly be divided into four components. And Sudeep and I will take you through these briefly for you to understand how WISER has shaped up, where we are at the end of phase 1 now, and then what our plans are for the next phase. So the first component of WISER phase 1 was stakeholder engagement. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We didn't want to start from scratch. We really wanted to make sure that we are engaging with sector players who, of course, have immense amount of sectoral knowledge, and they really know the ground realities. They have a good sense of what the pain points are, what is missing at the moment in outcome oriented water security assessments. And we really wanted to understand from them what this kind of a framework would mean for them, for their work, what they would like to see these indicators to be like. So we had very in-depth conversations with 12 stakeholders. These were grassroots organizations working in the water sector, donors, academia, policy think tanks as well. And we tried to understand from them how a framework like WISER could help them in the work that they do. So, of course, different perspectives, but what we really took away from this exercise was number one, that there is definitely a need that the sector acknowledges uh, for landscape level indicators. So, currently, we don't have landscape level outcome focused indicators in the sector. Most of us are using output level indicators, which of course have their place, but they're not really helping us get a holistic picture of the landscape. The second learning we had was that even for the outputs driven indicator frameworks that we currently use, the data that is collected requires a lot of time and a lot of money. And even after all of this time and money has been sunk into this data collection, over time, it still may not be helpful for us to helpful or useful for us to track water security. And then the third key learning that we heard from all of these stakeholders that we were talking to was that water security is really something that water as a resource is really interconnected with different aspects of society, of environment. And so you can't just look at one dimension or one indicator. You really need to think of water as being enmeshed in these different systems as well. So all of these inputs really helped us design the framework itself, which and we wanted to make sure that it takes into account this very important pain point of data collection and these kinds of primary surveys and also secondary data. Uh, there's a lot of time that is wasted in this, so we should find ways that are better, cheaper, faster for stakeholders to use in order to measure these indicators. So this was an important starting point for us, and then we went into simultaneously also doing some literature review and also some pilot testing, which Sudeep will talk about. So over to you, Sudeep.
Thank you, Aishwarya, for that introduction. To begin with, we wanted to make sure we come up with a holistic dimensions and a framework which covers all the aspects of water security. And we worked on creating water security indicator framework tailored for rural India. And we wanted this framework to be easily adaptable, but also scalable across the country. So one of the initial thing is there is no single definition of water security. So we went through all the literatures and we define it as sustainable and equitable availability of adequate water for both people and ecosystem, plus the ability to cope up with risk and ensure fair access. So keeping this in mind, we propose a structured framework adopted from the driver, pressure, state, impact, and response, DPSIR, what we call it, approach inspired by the socio-ecological system framework. In a context sensitive and which ensures relevance to regional conditions. Based on that, we selected 6 dimensions, that is water balance, water access, water productivity, water resilience, water governance, and water and ecosystem health as the key dimensions which will cover our framework. And within that framework, as I will take you to the next slide. So here you can see we have prioritized 12 indicators across 6 dimensions, and our focus was on making sure these dimensions are mutually exclusive but collectively exhaustive, which covers all the aspects of water security. So in the water balance, we have groundwater level, surface water extent, water stress as indicators, and we measure groundwater levels and surface water extent using the remote sensing and the CGWB data set. And in access, we wanted to make sure we measure both the drinking water access, the domestic water access, and the cropping intensity, and also the domestic water quality. In productivity, we wanted to measure the crop water productivity, that is the economic productivity per meter cube, what is the value we are generating, and then water and ecosystem health, we wanted to check what is the ambient water quality health. And in governance, we check the indicator local water governance. And in resilience, we wanted to see during the bad years, let's say there is a deficit rainfall years, how bad does it get? So we had an indicator to measure variation in cropping intensity and also propensity to drought and propensity to flood. So now we have the framework ready and we have the indicators. So we wanted to test this indicator to see how do they perform on the ground. Do they actually help us in solve like analyzing problem, detecting problem, and then what is the like in which direction can we go ahead once we analyze the problem. So total 30 households were surveyed across different states in five different aquifer typology. And we selected for the pilot two villages across these five states in Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. And here we also collected primary data, as Aishwarya already mentioned, like village level data. And also we wanted to check, because we are mostly using secondary data and remote sensing data for the indicators, we wanted to validate our remote sensing data, whatever we got. So we collected village level data also for the surface water extent indicator. We validated whether the maps we were generating from remote sensing were they correct or not. And then the pilot was really useful in understanding how our proposed indicator perform on the ground and adding nuance to our understanding of the landscape. It also gives us insight into which indicators can be improved upon. So I will take you. So total there are 12 indicators, but here I will take you to two indicators and explain how we did them and what were the results. So one of the indicators is cropping intensity, which comes under the dimension axis. So as you can see, we had certain selection criteria for each indicator. So our target was mostly outcome-oriented indicators, except for propensity to flood and propensity to drought, and they should be highly sensitive to work on the ground. And how relevant are these each indicators, and then the ease of capturing these indicators. And here, cropping intensity, basically this indicator is a measure of the number of crop cycles in a given year. And it is a useful proxy for access to irrigation. If you have access to irrigation, most probably we'll do once in Kharif and once in Rabi. So low cropping intensity indicates reliance on rainfall, which may also indicate climate vulnerability. So we use the National Remote Sensing Center NRSC land use dataset, and from that we identified single crop, double crop, and double cropping land use class. And based on that, we categorize them into higher cropping intensity class, low cropping intensity, and very high sort of thing. And here is the result for that indicator. As you can see, the villages in Punjab, both Chauke and Nagra, have very high cropping intensity. But one of the key insight is when we also, during our primary survey, we asked what is your primary source for the irrigation, and most of them told well, and that basically groundwater. So groundwater is the primary source in Punjab, and when we looked at our other indicator, that is the groundwater level, the groundwater levels are drastically decreasing in Punjab. And one of the other key insight is if you look in the state of Karnataka, both Biyargunda and Sulatgunda are neighboring villages, but one has access to the canal irrigation, and because of that, the cropping intensity is more than double of what the Sulatgunda is, and that is easily visible in the source of the irrigation. And another such indicator, what we found out is variation in cropping intensity. So this comes under the dimension resilience. Here we wanted to check during the bad years, how bad does it get, and do they decrease their cropping patterns? What is the change in the cropping pattern during the bad rainfall year? So the indicator shows reduction in cropping intensity in low rainfall years, and this is highly sensitive of cropping intensity may imply low water storage and very low access to irrigation water also. And we used first the IMD rainfall data to identify which are the deficit years. And during the deficit years, we went back to our cropping intensity indicator and checked what is the change in the cropping area. To just show you some results, as you can see, the villages in Punjab, both Chowke and Nagra, they for them a bad year or a good rainfall year doesn't matter because most of the primary source of irrigation is groundwater. So the seasonal reduction in cropping area is very low, as you can see here in the first graph. And then the villages in Maharashtra were highly impacted whenever there was a bad year. As you can see, Hipparga, Rava, and Malegaon both. If there was a bad year, the seasonal reduction in Rabi increased to 80% and 90%. And coming to the neighboring villages in Karnataka, because Biyargunda has access to irrigation, if there was a bad year, the Kharif and Rabi both were not that much impacted. But for Sulatgunda, they were somehow taken care during the Kharif period. There was only 30%, 33% reduction in the Kharif area, but the Rabi cropping took a severe hit if there was a bad year. And based on the seasonal cropping area reduction, we classified the villages into high resilient, low resilient, moderate resilient. And the villages in Punjab were very high resilient. And then the villages Bangai in UP was slightly high resilient. And then both the Maharashtrian villages and the Chhattisgarh villages were very low resilient when it comes to cropping intensity. So whenever there is a bad year, these villages were highly impacted. And similarly, we have calculated all the indicators and we have listed the methodology. The results are linked in the report. Please go through that report and you will find the numbers for all the other indicators. Yeah. Finally, after calculating the numbers for all the 12 indicators, we came up with a matrix. So here it will be very useful to look at all the aspects of water security for a particular village. And here, when you look for Punjab, if you just single out access and domestic water quality, all these three indicators are really good. But when you look at the complete picture, they are coming at the cost of groundwater levels. And here there is the change in groundwater level from 2005 to 2021. There is very high in Punjab, and also the ambient water quality is very poor in Punjab. And similarly, when you look at the villages in Chhattisgarh and Maharashtra, the variation in cropping intensity, the resilience is very low, and even the access to the irrigation water, the cropping intensity is very poor, 84%, 54 and 49 in Malegaon and Hippargarava. And coming to Karnataka, the Sulatgunda and Biyargunda, as I told, they are neighboring villages. But when you look at the resilience, Sulatgunda is very low resilience, but it has access to the canal irrigation. It is moderate resilience, but very high cropping intensity. It is almost 170% cropping intensity. So both Kharif and Rabi cropping is really good in Biyargunda. So a matrix like this will give us an idea of all the aspects of water security and will help us understand how the water, as Aishwarya already told, is interconnected. We should not look at each aspect or each dimension of water security separately. They are all interconnected. So collectively looking at indicators will give us a better picture of the water security. And finally, we hope a scorecard for each village, we call it a WISER scorecard, will give us how the village is doing in terms of water security. So here for Sulatgunda, with only 72% cropping intensity and very low water productivity score, 29 rupees per meter cube, agriculture output in Sulatgunda remains very limited, but it has very safe water stress levels, a strong domestic water access, and the area faces very high drought propensity, and it has very low resilience, signaling vulnerability to agricultural stability. So when it came to the water governance, they didn't have any water governance body. So with 0% local water governance score and the surface water reduction in summer compared to the post monsoon, it was 98%. So 98% reduction in surface water extent. there is heavy dependence on existing water bodies. So we need to strengthen the governance and implement better flood control and drought reduction measures in Sulabhota. The similar WISER scorecard for BR Munda looks slightly better when the cropping intensity is really high at 168%, and the productivity value is 40 INR per meter cube. As I told, they have access to irrigation water, so the cropping productivity value is really good, and the agriculture thrives. But moderate resilience and high drought frequency pose as the risk. So there were no water bodies in BR Munda, yet the flood vulnerability is slightly high, highlighting need for better water management and infrastructure in BR Munda. So similarly, our plan for the future is to have a wiser scorecard for all the villages across India. So that will help us identify any particular problems and how to, and also to monitor the previous steps taken. Are they improving the water security or not?
Thanks, Sudeep. So once we completed this pilot testing and we had some of these scores, we really wanted to make sure that we go back to the stakeholders and really talk to them and understand from them if this kind of a wiser framework with these scores, with this kind of interpretation, is going to be useful for the work that they do, both problem diagnosis as well as impact assessment. So we spent a few weeks having intense conversations with these stakeholders that we had earlier spoken to. We conducted listening circles, we had technical experts review our framework, our scores, and give us feedback in terms of scientific rigor, in terms of usability, as well as other kinds of inputs where given our future plans, we also wanted to understand from stakeholders how WISER can look in the future, what it should keep in mind as we try and scale this up, like Sudeep said, across the country in a few years' time. So we really spent some time listening to the sector, listening to different stakeholders and their feedback. We also conducted a roundtable discussion in Bangalore in March of 2025, where we had 30 stakeholders from across the water sector, again, representatives from academia, donor organizations, and grassroots organizations join us to review the phase one pilot results and also to discuss and hear from them how they would like to engage with WISER going forward. We got some great learnings and feedback from all of this. Just going back to the sector and listening to what they had to say. For example, we got great insights into how we can design for scale in a sustainable way. We understood from different stakeholders who have done this before how we can actually maintain scientific rigor in a framework like WISER, but then also maintain and make sure that communication of these findings is simple and easy to understand for stakeholders as well as the larger public. And that's when the real interest will be generated around work like this. We also got some good technical feedback as well from different technical experts and experts in the field of water security, where we were asked to look at certain proxy indicators for certain dimensions, as well as look at maybe a mix of static and dynamic indicators that we could take into account to just make this framework a little bit more usable for different kinds of stakeholders. The roundtable also helped us understand what kinds of stakeholders and what participants from within the room would actually be interested in working with us on WISER phase 2 and all the different ways in which they can contribute, and also just shaping the future direction of the initiative as well. As we reflect on our activities from phase 1, we realize that there are a few things we want to keep in mind given the feedback that we've received and how we want to shape WISER going into the future. We want to make sure that WISER as a framework is not just a measurement tool, but it should actually be something that drives change in the water sector, where it really shifts the conversation, moves the needle from very outputs focused measurement of water security to really thinking about outcomes at a landscape level. In order to make sure we can do this, we need to distinguish very clearly between output and outcome indicators, because outcome indicators are really the ones that can have an effect on how stakeholders are constructing their strategy going forward, deciding how resources are allocated, and also how they're assessing and managing their own impact in their geographies and landscapes. We also realize that in order for an initiative like WISER to be successful, we require a broad coalition of the community, of civil society organizations across the country, because we really want this model of data collection, data ownership to be something that is very, very participatory. And that's something we really want to build into, especially the primary data collection side of WISER. We really want to build in transparency, we want to build in accuracy and just public ownership and acceptability as well of this data. So when the community does this for themselves and by themselves, it really produces something that is very community driven and sustainable in the long term as well. We also got some good feedback from stakeholders in terms of things that we want to just remember as we continue to improve upon the framework and the indicators. We want to make sure that we choose the right kind of unit of analysis. We want to make sure that our sampling designs are adaptable across different contexts and different scales. And we also want to make sure that we think with the future in mind, that over time we will require large scale data infrastructure, and how do we build that into our phased design to scale. So what's next for WISER? Eventually we want to make sure that this framework helps the water sector align and congregate and have some consensus around this outcome based framework. It should eventually help them prioritize when they're making decisions. The data helps them prioritize which outcomes they want to most urgently focus on. And once they have made their decision and implemented the interventions, they also are able to use this framework to assess the impact of their decisions as well. And over time, we want to make sure that WISER is able to produce data from national level annual sample surveys, which can complement the remote sensing data and the secondary data that is going into creating the scores that Sudeep showed you on the screen a while back. And this is really going to help us achieve that objective of going from anecdotal reporting around water security, which currently exists in India. We have patchy data, bits and pieces, some areas of the country where we know water scarcity and water issues always persist. But we really want to bring that through these kinds of annual large-scale sample surveys. We want to make that anecdotal evidence, we want to construct a more systematic understanding around water security. So we go from anecdotal to really systematic, real-time tracking year on year of this data. So in phase 1, we developed and piloted the WISER framework. In phase 2, we aim to do 3 things. We want to develop sort of a dashboard or an output that really helps us streamline all of the secondary data analysis that we're doing at different levels. So we really want to scale this up and see how we can create something that becomes easy to use when you want to look at data at district and state levels. We also want to make sure that when we are working with the community, we want to build robust primary data collection protocols so that we can start collecting that primary data at scale as well. So we want to test this in a few districts first, but with time we want to do it in larger and larger samples. So the point of phase 2, the main goal really is going to be to establish WISER's value and its adaptability across different contexts and for different stakeholders at different scales. The way that we want to test whether or not WISER is not just a measurement tool but also a driver of change. We want to do this by testing WISER along two pathways in phase two. But the first pathway is bottom up, where we really want to implement WISER as a local community driven exercise where the communities are integrating the primary data that they collect themselves into the secondary data which the WISER team produces and makes available on a WISER dashboard. And they should be able to use the scores and the interpretation of the WISER indicator scores to be able to make their own decisions around local water governance. Hopefully, this helps in better resource allocation at the grassroots level and also just better problem diagnosis and impact assessment over time at the landscape level. The second pathway we want to also test is top down. So, we want to partner with state governments and see if we can use WISER in a slightly different context and slightly different at a slightly different scale as well. So, doing really large scale assessments using primarily secondary and remote sensing data to produce WISER indicator scores, which will help the state governments and the stakeholders at the state level to really use those insights for state policy planning. So we are hoping that they can make use of WISER to identify specific water security dimensions that require the most urgent prioritization, and then allocate resources and track progress over time for those dimensions accordingly. So these are the two pathways that we are very excited to test WISER along and see how change manifests with the ultimate goal of improving water security in India over time. So WISER, of course, is a very ambitious initiative, but we're just at the beginning of this journey. Phase one was very, very fruitful for us because we really understood from all of the enthusiastic participation that we had from different stakeholders. We understood that the water sector is now ready for this kind of a robust, outcomes focused indicator framework. We are ready to shift our, the conversation is ready to be shifted to a more outcome driven landscape level understanding of water security. What we really want to do in phase two as we move forward is to make WISER more practical and more impactful in terms of creating that change and making that shift itself. So if in phase one, if we've created the needle, in phase two, we want to move that needle on water security in India. And we're very excited for this next phase. And if you are a stakeholder in the water sector in India today who's also excited about being a part of such an initiative, please do get in touch with us and we would love to collaborate with you on the second phase of WISER. You can learn a little bit more about phase one, the pilot results, as well as all of the stakeholder engagements and the roundtable discussions that we had. This is available on the Well Labs website in a two-part series, which just documents all of the pilot results, the literature review summary, as well as all of the learnings from phase one. So you're very welcome to have a look at that, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.